Sergeant Marshall thought he'd detained just another defiant man. But within hours, his world unraveled in court. What unfolded next would shock the nation and make headlines everywhere. Let us know where you're watching from. If you admire the righteous characters in this story, give us a thumbs up and subscribe now. On a bright and beautiful morning, the gentle breeze rustled through the leaves as Captain Liam cruised down the road on his usual weekend patrol shift. The streets were calm, dotted with a few pedestrians walking leisurely on the opposite side, their faces lit with joy as they embraced the weekend. As Liam's patrol car moved steadily along the route, something caught his attention. A sleek black car passed by, and inside was a sharply dressed black man in a perfectly tailored suit, exuding confidence with an air of authority. There was something about the man's poised demeanor that instantly rubbed Liam the wrong way. He couldn't quite pinpoint why, but his mind began to race with thoughts. That guy thinks he owns the road, Liam muttered under his breath, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. To him, the man's calm and composed attitude seemed almost provocative, as though it were a silent challenge to his authority. Liam's irritation grew with each second, and his instinct told him to act on it. Deciding he had enough of the man's confident presence, Liam flicked on the patrol lights and signaled for the black car to pull over. His heart quickened, not from nerves but from anticipation. He was ready to confront this man, to assert his position, and perhaps remind him who had the real power on this road. The black man stepped out of the car with an air of unshakable confidence, every step deliberate, his posture exuding control. Liam's irritation flared instantly. He wasn't used to being met with such composure, especially not from someone he'd just pulled over. "You're being fined for speeding. Let me see your papers," Liam barked, his voice edged with authority. He stood tall, expecting the usual compliance, but the man turned to him, calm and unfazed, locking eyes with him. "I was driving 35 in a 40 zone," the man said firmly, his voice deep and even. "I believe that's within the limit." Liam's eyes narrowed, his annoyance rising. "That's true," he snapped, stepping closer. "But not on this road, and especially not in front of me." His glare was sharp, cutting through the morning air like a blade, daring the man to push back. But the man didn't waver. His towering presence and unwavering confidence only fueled Liam's frustration. To Liam, this wasn't just about a speeding ticket, it was personal, a silent battle for control. And in his simmering anger, he didn't realize he was standing face to face with one of the most famous men in the world, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Liam's eyes flicked over Dwayne's license, finding nothing unusual. But he wasn't about to let this man go so easily. His pride demanded more. The real confrontation was just beginning. "Your silence," Liam spat, his voice dripping with hostility. "Is that your way of disrespecting me? A black guy like you, standing there like you've done nothing wrong, acting righteous?" His voice rose, his neck veins straining, and his eyes burned with barely contained fury, locking onto Dwayne's calm expression like a predator circling its prey. Dwayne, unshaken, met Liam's glare with the same steady composure. "I haven't done anything wrong," he said evenly, his voice calm but firm, refusing to escalate the situation. Beneath the surface of his calm exterior, Dwayne's instincts as a public figure kicked in. Without moving a muscle, his thumb discreetly pressed the recording button on his phone, already resting in his pocket. He didn't need to make a show of it. Years in the spotlight had taught him to anticipate moments like these, where calm preparation was his best defense. Liam's frustration only deepened as he stared into the unyielding calm of the man before him, his authority feeling like it was slipping through his fingers. The tension in the air was palpable, and Liam, consumed by anger, was determined to make his dominance known. Liam's eyes burned with disdain as he loomed over Dwayne, his voice dripping with venom. "People like you," he spat, his tone sharp and cutting, "are born guilty. You don't even have to do anything. Just existing is already a crime. And fairness? Don't make me laugh. That's a privilege for people like me, white people. Not for so." Dwayne's steady gaze didn't waver, his voice calm but resolute as he replied, "Everyone deserves to be treated equally." "Equally?" Liam barked, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. Do you even hear yourself? Equality isn't for people like you. Look at you. Look at where you come from, what you are. Do you really think you deserve the same rights as me? People like you don't belong here, not in the same world as us. The only place you'll ever fit is beneath our feet." His words were filled with scorn, each syllable like a dagger meant to cut down Dwayne's composure. Liam's voice rose with each hateful remark, as if volume alone could establish his dominance. But Dwayne remained still, his calm like a wall against the officer's storm. Inside his pocket, the phone continued to record, capturing every word of Liam's bile-filled tirade. The tension hung thick in the air, the sheer force of Liam's prejudice crashing against Dwayne's unwavering resolve. The battle wasn't just about words, it was about something far deeper. And while Liam's hate burned bright, Dwayne's quiet strength refused to be extinguished. Dwayne stood firm, his calm expression a stark contrast to Liam's growing rage. The officer's hateful words came in relentless waves, each more venomous than the last. Yet, Dwayne didn't flinch, didn't fight back. His silence, steady and unbroken, was its own defiance, and that infuriated Liam beyond reason. "You think you can just stand there and look down on me?" Liam snarled, stepping closer. "You don't have the right to talk back, let alone act like you're better than me." Dwayne met his glare with an unshaken gaze. "I haven't done anything wrong," he said evenly. "You don't have the right to treat anyone this way. Don't tell me what I can or can't do." Liam's voice rose, echoing in the street. Without warning, his fist shot forward, landing a hard punch into Dwayne's stomach. The impact forced Dwayne to stagger slightly, but he quickly steadied himself, his expression shifting to one of quiet resolve rather than anger. The bystanders gasped, some shouting in protest, their phones capturing the escalating confrontation. Dwayne, despite the pain, didn't retaliate. He stood tall, his silence more powerful than any punch he could have thrown. Liam, emboldened by his own aggression, reached for his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for resisting and obstructing justice," he barked, his tone sharp and vindictive. Grabbing Dwayne's wrist, he yanked it roughly behind his back, snapping the cuffs on with unnecessary force. "You can't do this," Dwayne said firmly, his voice steady despite the humiliation. "I haven't resisted or done anything wrong." "Shut up," Liam snapped, his tone dripping with scorn. "You don't get to decide that." He tightened the cuffs as if to make a point, ignoring the growing crowd of onlookers filming every second of the encounter. As Liam shoved him toward the patrol car, Dwayne's calm didn't waver. His mind was already focused on what came next. Every word, every action, had been recorded, not just by the crowd but by his own phone, quietly capturing everything from his pocket. This wasn't just an arrest. It was an abuse of power that would not go unnoticed. And though Dwayne felt the weight of the moment, he also knew the truth would eventually rise. For Liam, this might have been about domination, but for Dwayne, it was about something far greater, a fight for accountability that was just beginning. Dwayne was led down the narrow hallway of the police station, his wrists bound tightly in handcuffs, the cold metal biting into his skin. Liam walked behind him, his grip firm on Dwayne's arm, his every step heavy with authority and simmering anger. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the weight of what had just happened still lingered. The interrogation room was small and sterile, lit by a single overhead bulb that cast harsh shadows across the walls. Jimmy, one of Liam's colleagues, was seated at the table, casually flipping through a stack of papers. He looked up as they entered, his expression curious when he saw Dwayne. "What's this about?" Jimmy asked, leaning back in his chair. "Your problem now," Liam said curtly, shoving Dwayne into the room. He uncuffed him roughly, the metal scraping against Dwayne's wrists, leaving faint red marks. "He's all yours." Jimmy raised an eyebrow as he scanned Dwayne. "Name?" he asked, picking up his pen and notebook. "Dwayne Johnson," Dwayne replied, his voice calm, and even despite the hostility he'd endured. Jimmy's eyes widened in recognition. "Wait a second, Dwayne Johnson? The Rock? The action star? Huh, this just got interesting." A smirk spread across his face as he leaned forward. "You're being charged with speeding and resisting arrest." A couple of days from now, you'll be in court. I hope you've got a good lawyer." Dwayne didn't react to the snide remark, keeping his composure. His silence only seemed to provoke Liam further. The officer had lingered by the door, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Dwayne with barely concealed contempt. "This black bastard," Liam spat suddenly, his voice loud and filled with venom, "thinks he's untouchable, like he's better than everyone else. I'm going to make sure he knows exactly where he belongs." Jimmy chuckled awkwardly, clearly caught off guard by the outburst. "Hey, man, it's your case. Handle it however you want. I'll just write the report in order." Dwayne turned his head toward Liam, his calm demeanor unshaken. "You don't have the right to insult or mistreat anyone," he said firmly, "especially not as a police officer." Liam's eyes narrowed, his expression twisting with fury. "Don't tell me what I can or can't do," he snapped, his voice rising. "You think you're special because you're famous? Because you've got money? Let me tell you something. You're nothing here. Just another piece of trash who doesn't know his place." Dwayne didn't flinch, even as Liam's words grew more hateful. Instead, he met the officer's glare with steady resolve. "Everyone has the right to be treated with dignity," he replied. "Even people you look down on." Liam's laugh was sharp and bitter, his anger boiling over. "Dignity? You don't get dignity. People like you don't deserve it. And you think a lawyer is going to save you? You're just another arrogant punk who's about to learn a hard lesson. I want to contact my lawyer," Dwayne said, his voice unwavering. Jimmy stood, raising his hands in mock surrender. All right, let the man call his lawyer. I'll go finish the paperwork." Liam glared at Dwayne for a long moment, his fists clenched at his sides, before finally storming out of the room. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Dwayne alone in the oppressive silence. Hours later, Dwayne sat in a small holding cell, his mind replaying the events of the day. He felt the sting of Liam's punch, the humiliation of being cuffed in public, the weight of the officer's hateful words, but he refused to let it break him. Instead, he focused on the next step, proving his innocence and exposing the truth. When his lawyer arrived, Dwayne felt a flicker of relief. Lisa Carter was a sharp, no-nonsense attorney with a reputation for dismantling cases like this. She sat across from him in the cramped interview room, her expression serious as she listened to his account of what had happened. "Let me get this straight," Lisa said, her voice firm. "You were pulled over for allegedly speeding, and when you didn't react the way this officer wanted, he escalated things. He hit you, arrested you, and then insulted you while you were in custody?" Dwayne nodded. "That's exactly what happened, and I have proof." Lisa's eyebrows rose. "Proof? I recorded the whole thing on my phone," Dwayne said, his tone calm but resolute. "It's still in my pocket. The recording captured everything, his threats, his insults, even the punch." Lisa leaned back, her expression shifting to one of determination. "Good. That changes everything. We can use that recording to show exactly what happened and counter any false narrative they try to push." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "Did he say anything that could indicate racial bias? Anything we can tie to his treatment of you?" Dwayne met her gaze, his jaw tightening. "He called me a black bastard and said people like me don't belong here. He made it clear he thinks he's above me, above the law." Lisa exhaled sharply, her hands resting on the table. "This is bad, really bad for him. Not just the abuse of power, but the blatant racism. Once we present this in court, he's going to have a lot to answer for." Dwayne nodded, his calm demeanor masking the fire inside him. "I don't want this to just be about me," he said. "This happens to people all the time, people who don't have the platform I have. I want to make sure this stops. For good." Lisa's expression softened slightly, but her resolve remained firm. "We'll make sure the truth comes out. Dwayne, this isn't just about clearing your name. It's about holding people like Liam accountable." As they prepared to leave, Lisa glanced at him. "Stay calm. No matter what happens next, they'll try to spin this. But with that recording, we have the upper hand. Trust me, we'll win this." Dwayne nodded, his determination unwavering. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to fight. not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, mistreated, or dismissed. This was more than a legal battle. It was a fight for justice, and Dwayne was determined to see it through to the end. Lisa sat across from Dwayne in the small, oppressive interview room, her voice steady but firm. "I'm going to post bail to get you out of here until the trial," she said, her piercing gaze locking onto his. "But listen carefully. No matter what that officer says or does to provoke you, you cannot retaliate. Do you understand? Every word, every action will be used to build our case, and we need him to dig his own grave, not give him any ammunition against you." Dwayne nodded, his calm exterior masking the storm of emotions within. "I won't give him anything," he said evenly, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "But we're going to make sure he pays for what he's done, right?" Lisa stood, smoothing her blazer and gathering her papers. "We will. Trust me, Dwayne. We'll gather every piece of evidence, every witness, and every shred of truth to hold him accountable. He won't walk away from this unscathed." As Lisa left to process the bail paperwork, Dwayne was escorted back to the holding cell. The cold, metallic clang of the door closing behind him echoed in his ears. The stark walls and unforgiving steel bars were a harsh reminder of the injustice he was fighting against. He stood there, hands resting on the bars, his mind resolute. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about standing up to an abuse of power, about setting an example for those who didn't have the resources or platform to fight back. A short while later, Lisa returned, her expression calm and collected as she approached him. "It's done," she said, motioning to the officer nearby to unlock the cell. "You're being released, but remember what I said. Keep your composure, no matter what." As Dwayne stepped out of the cell, Liam appeared, leaning casually against the wall with a smug smirk plastered across his face. His eyes burned with a mix of anger and arrogance. A man drunk on the power he believed he held. "Well, look at that," Liam sneered, his tone dripping with disdain. "Getting out already? Huh, don't get too comfortable, Johnson. Those bars might be behind you now, but it won't be long before they're your permanent home." Dwayne paused, his eyes meeting Liam's with unflinching calm. He didn't respond, didn't give Liam the satisfaction of rising to the bait. Instead, he straightened his posture, his towering presence a silent statement of strength and resolve. Liam stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, venomous tone. "You think you're walking away from this? Think again. People like you always end up back where they belong, behind bars. Enjoy your little taste of freedom while it lasts." Lisa stepped forward, placing herself between Liam and Dwayne. Her voice was cold and sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. "That's enough, Officer Marshall. You've already crossed enough lines for one lifetime. I'd suggest you think very carefully about your words and actions from here on out. This case is far from over." Liam glared at her, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing more. Dwayne didn't look back as he walked past the officer, his focus set on the fight ahead. This wasn't over, not for Liam, not for the system that allowed people like him to abuse their power, and certainly not for Dwayne. As they stepped outside, the fresh air hit Dwayne's face like a welcome reprieve from the suffocating weight of the station. Lisa turned to him, her tone softening slightly. "This is just the beginning. We have a long road ahead, but we'll get justice. Dwayne, you have my word." Dwayne nodded, his calm composure unwavering. "I trust you. Lisa, let's make sure he never gets the chance to do this to anyone else again." The battle was far from over, but for the first time that day, Dwayne felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, mistreated, or overlooked. And he wasn't going to stop until the truth came out and justice was served. A few days later, the trial began, and the courthouse was a scene of chaos. The incident involving Dwayne Johnson and Officer Liam Marshall had captured national attention, with bystander videos going viral and sparking outrage across the country. Crowds of people gathered outside, some holding signs calling for justice, others merely curious to see how the case would unfold. Dozens of reporters and television crews lined the steps, their cameras trained on the arriving cars. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the entire world was holding its breath for what was about to happen. The sleek black SUV carrying Dwayne Johnson pulled up to the curb, and the crowd erupted in a frenzy. Camera flashes lit up the morning air as reporters jostled for position, their voices cutting through the noise. "Mr. Johnson, how do you feel about today's trial?" one reporter shouted. "Do you think justice will be served?" yelled another. Dwayne stepped out of the car, his towering figure drawing gasps from the crowd. His expression was calm but firm, the determination in his eyes unshaken despite the chaos surrounding him. A reporter managed to get close enough to ask, "Mr. Johnson, how do you think this story will end?" Dwayne paused, turning slightly to address the journalist. His deep voice carried over the noise, commanding attention. "I won't comment on the outcome until the trial concludes," he said, his tone steady and measured. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the courthouse doors, flanked by his lawyer, Lisa Carter. The reporters shouted more questions, their voices desperate to elicit another response. But Dwayne and Lisa remained silent, their focus unbroken as they disappeared into the building. Moments later, another car arrived. Liam Marshall stepped out, his face tight with a mixture of frustration and unease. The crowd's mood shifted noticeably, with murmurs of disapproval rippling through those gathered. Cameras turned sharply to capture his every move, and reporters hurled questions at him. "Officer Marshall, do you have anything to say about the allegations against you? Do you regret your actions that day?" Liam didn't respond, his jaw clenched as he glared at the crowd. His steps were quick and deliberate as he pushed past the reporters and entered the courthouse. Yet, his unease was evident. This was no ordinary trial. His career and reputation were on the line, and the overwhelming public scrutiny only added to the pressure. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense and heavy. Every seat in the gallery was filled, with members of the public, journalists, and even celebrities there to witness the proceedings. This wasn't just a trial about one man's abuse of power. It had become a symbol of a larger societal reckoning. The fight for accountability and justice had taken center stage, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. As Dwayne took his seat beside Lisa, his mind was focused. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about exposing the truth and ensuring that abuse of power and prejudice would no longer be ignored. Across the room, Liam sat stiffly, his confident facade cracking under the weight of the moment. The stage was set for a battle that would determine more than just guilt or innocence. It would challenge the very systems that allowed such injustices to persist. Liam sat stiffly at the prosecution table, his body radiating tension as the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. He shifted in his chair, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto Dwayne across the room. There was a deliberate intensity in Liam's stare, a simmering hostility that seemed to cut through the charged air. His lips curled into a faint, smug smirk, a calculated expression meant to provoke. His gaze was sharp and unrelenting, filled with unspoken venom, as if silently taunting Dwayne. "You'll know your place soon enough." His eyes seemed to say, "Don't even think about challenging us. You and I, we're not the same." The corners of his mouth twitched, and the smirk widened ever so slightly, his confidence in the system that had always shielded him evident in his demeanor. Liam leaned back in his chair, his posture casual but his eyes still fixed on Dwayne like a predator sizing up prey. It was a clear display of dominance, an unspoken declaration that he believed he held all the power. He was daring Dwayne to react, to falter under the weight of his stare. But Dwayne didn't give him the satisfaction. Dwayne sat calmly, his composure unshaken. His silence spoke volumes, a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the room. Every inch of him exuded strength and resolve, overshadowing Liam's attempts to intimidate. The smirk on Liam's face faltered for a split second, though he quickly tried to mask it. Yet, the power dynamic in the room was clear. Dwayne's unyielding presence rendered Liam's provocations meaningless, leaving the officer's hostility to hang in the air. Unanswered, the courtroom was silent, the air heavy with anticipation as the prosecutor stood and addressed the jury with unwavering confidence. He adjusted his tie, his demeanor sharp and professional, exuding authority as he began his statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said, his voice steady and deliberate. "We are here today to uphold the principles of law and order. This case is about accountability, responsibility, and the actions of two individuals on a day that has now become the center of public attention." He paused, glancing at the jury to ensure he had their full attention. The defendant, Mr. Dwayne Johnson, was observed violating traffic laws by Officer Liam Marshall, a dedicated and experienced member of law enforcement. Officer Marshall, acting in accordance with his sworn duty to protect the public and enforce the law, initiated a routine traffic stop to address the infraction. The prosecutor stepped closer to the jury, gesturing with his hands to emphasize his point. What should have been a straightforward encounter escalated unnecessarily, not because of Officer Marshall, but because of the defendant's behavior. Rather than comply with the lawful order to stop his vehicle and present identification, Mr. Johnson chose to resist. His defiance placed not only himself but also Officer Marshall in a situation that required immediate action. He turned slightly, his eyes shifting toward Liam, who sat rigidly at the prosecution table. Officer Marshall, in the face of defiance and potential danger, maintained his professionalism. He followed protocol, detaining Mr. Johnson to ensure the situation did not escalate further. This was not an abuse of power. As the defense may suggest, this was a law enforcement officer doing his job, protecting the public and upholding the law. The prosecutor's voice grew firmer, his tone almost reverent as he continued. "We trust our officers to make split-second decisions in moments of uncertainty." And Officer Marshall did just that. His actions were justified and necessary to maintain order. To suggest otherwise would undermine the very foundation of our justice system. He turned back to the jury, his expression resolute. And what of Mr. Johnson's actions? A man of fame and influence who should serve as a role model to others, yet instead chose to disregard the law. He resisted a lawful order, challenged authority, and forced an officer to take measures that could have been avoided entirely had he simply complied. The prosecutor's gaze swept across the jury, his words deliberate and weighted. This case is not about race, fame, or influence. It is about an individual who believed he was above the law and a police officer who refused to let that belief stand unchallenged. We must send a clear message today that no one is exempt from accountability, regardless of their status. He stepped back, returning to his seat with an air of satisfaction, as though he had delivered an unassailable argument. The courtroom remained silent for a moment, the jury processing his words, while Liam sat at the table with a faint smirk, his confidence seemingly bolstered by the prosecutor's praise. The defense remained composed, with Lisa Carter watching intently, her expression neutral but her mind already preparing for what was to come. This was only the beginning, and she knew the real fight was yet to unfold. Lisa Carter stood from the defense table, her posture straight, her expression calm but steely. She approached the jury with deliberate steps, each movement carrying the weight of her argument. Turning to face them, her voice rang clear and steady, resonating in the otherwise silent courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her tone calm but firm, "we are here today not only to examine the actions of my client, Mr. Dwayne Johnson, but to scrutinize the behavior and intentions of the officer who detained him, behavior that goes against the very principles of justice and equality." Lisa stepped closer to the jury box, her gaze sharp. "My client was driving at a lawful speed of 35 miles per hour, within the limits set for the road. He complied with traffic laws and posed no danger to anyone. Yet, despite this, he was stopped by Officer Liam Marshall, not for speeding, but because of something far more troubling." She turned to Liam, who sat stiffly at the witness stand, visibly uncomfortable under her piercing gaze. "Officer Marshall," Lisa began, her voice unwavering, "can you explain why you decided to pull over Mr. Johnson, a man driving within the speed limit?" Liam hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying. "He seemed suspicious." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious? In what way? Was he weaving across lanes? Ignoring traffic signs? Speeding?" "No," Liam admitted reluctantly. "He was just acting confident." The courtroom murmured faintly, and Lisa allowed the moment to sink in before pressing forward. "Acting confident," she repeated. "Tell me, Officer Marshall, would you have found the same behavior suspicious if it were a white driver in a suit? Exuding the same confidence?" Liam's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer immediately. Lisa didn't wait. She continued, her voice cutting through the room. "Because it seems, Officer Marshall, that your decision to stop my client was not based on any actual violation of the law, but on a bias against a black man driving a nice car, wearing a suit, and carrying himself with confidence." Lisa's words hung in the air as she stepped closer to the witness stand. Her eyes locked on Liam. "Let's move on to what happened after you stopped Mr. Johnson. You claim he resisted arrest. Is that correct?" "Yes," Liam replied, his tone defensive. "And yet," Lisa said, "you can provide no evidence of resistance. Instead, there are witnesses who saw you escalate the situation, culminating in you striking my client without provocation. Is that correct?" "That's not how it happened," Liam said quickly, his voice rising slightly. "He was defiant." Lisa leaned in slightly, her voice calm but sharp as a blade. "Defiant? Or simply refusing to let you abuse your authority? Because, Officer Marshall, there is video evidence, video that shows you throwing a punch at Mr. Johnson. Tell me, where in your training does it say that striking an unarmed and cooperative individual is acceptable?" Liam's face flushed, his confidence visibly faltering. Lisa didn't let up. "Officer Marshall, your actions that day were not just unprofessional, they were unlawful. You used your position not to enforce the law, but to intimidate, to demean, and to harm. And today, you sit here, hoping this jury will excuse behavior that has no place in a just society." Lisa turned back to the jury, her voice steady and resolute. "This case is not just about Mr. Johnson. It's about holding those in power accountable. It's about ensuring that prejudice and abuse of authority have no place in our legal system. And it's about sending a clear message. No one is above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it." The courtroom was tense as Lisa Carter returned to her seat, her words still hanging in the air. The jury shifted uncomfortably, their expressions reflective as they processed the damning questions Lisa had posed to Officer Liam Marshall. His testimony, filled with contradictions and excuses, had only further unraveled under Lisa's relentless cross-examination. The once confident officer now sat stiffly, his face pale and his arrogance replaced by visible unease. The judge turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard the arguments from both sides. You will soon deliberate on the facts of this case. But first, the defendant has requested the opportunity to address this court." All eyes turned to Dwayne Johnson as he rose from his seat, towering yet composed. He adjusted his suit jacket and stepped toward the podium, the weight of the moment evident in his steady posture. The room fell silent, every camera, every eye fixed on him. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Dwayne began, his voice deep and unwavering. "I stand before you not as a celebrity, not as someone seeking special treatment, but as a man, an ordinary man who was stopped, detained, and humiliated simply because of how I look." He paused, letting his words settle in the room. "On the day in question, I was doing nothing wrong. I followed the law, drove within the speed limit, and complied with every traffic regulation. Yet, I was pulled over, not because of my actions, but because of assumptions. Assumptions about who I am, what I represent, and where I belong." Dwayne's voice grew more passionate, though he remained composed. "I am a black man in America, and sadly, that fact alone makes me a target in the eyes of some. I was not treated with respect or dignity. I was treated as a threat, as someone who needed to be controlled, not because of what I did, but because of the color of my skin and the confidence I carry." He turned slightly, looking toward the jury, his expression sincere and resolute. "This isn't just about me. It's about the countless others who face similar treatment every day, those who don't have the platform or the resources to fight back. This trial is about justice, not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been silenced, dismissed, or mistreated because of prejudice." Dwayne's voice softened slightly, his tone reflective. I've worked hard my entire life to earn the opportunities one have, but no matter how much success I achieve, I am still reduced to stereotypes by people like Officer Marshall, someone who should have been a protector, but instead became the source of harm. He looked directly at the jury. Today, I ask you not just to see me as Dwayne Johnson, the actor, but as a human being, a man who believes in fairness, in equality, and in accountability. I ask you to consider the evidence, to see the truth, and to take a stand against the kind of injustice that corrodes the foundation of our society. As Dwayne stepped back, the room was silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone present. The jury exchanged glances, their faces marked by both reflection and emotion. It was clear that Dwayne's heartfelt statement had resonated deeply, shifting the scales of justice in his favor. The jury returned to the courtroom after hours of deliberation, their expressions serious and resolute. The tension in the room was palpable as the foreperson stood, holding the paper that would announce their decision. The judge nodded for her to speak. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Dwayne Johnson, not guilty on all charges," the foreperson announced, her voice steady but firm. A wave of relief swept through the courtroom, murmurs rippling among the audience. Dwayne remained composed, though the subtle relaxation of his shoulders betrayed the weight he'd been carrying. The judge raised her hand to quiet the room before turning her attention to the matter of Officer Liam Marshall. "Before we adjourn," the judge began, her tone sharp and authoritative, "this court would like to address the conduct of Officer Liam Marshall. The evidence presented, including video recordings, eyewitness accounts, and his own testimony, has revealed behavior that is deeply troubling and grossly inconsistent with the responsibilities of a law enforcement officer." She fixed her gaze on Liam, who sat stiffly, his once smug demeanor now replaced by an anxious pallor. "Your actions were not only an abuse of power, but a clear violation of the trust placed in you by the public. This court cannot and will not tolerate such behavior." The judge's next words struck like a hammer, effective immediately. "Officer Marshall is suspended from duty pending a full investigation. Furthermore, I am referring this case to the district attorney's office to open a criminal investigation into your actions, including charges of assault, abuse of power, and racial discrimination." Gasps rippled through the courtroom as Liam's face turned ashen. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but the judge's steely glare silenced him. This case is no longer just about a single incident. It has become clear that this is part of a pattern of misconduct. Within hours, the investigation expanded. Journalists and officials began digging into Liam's history, and what they uncovered sent shockwaves through the community. Reports emerged of previous incidents where Liam had used excessive force or targeted individuals based on their race. Complaints that had been ignored or quietly dismissed suddenly resurfaced, painting a damning picture of a man who had operated unchecked for far too long. The district attorney's office wasted no time in announcing formal charges against Liam Marshall. He was arrested days later, facing counts of assault, misconduct, and abuse of power. His actions, once shielded by his badge, were now under the harsh scrutiny of both the legal system and the public eye. For Dwayne, the moment was bittersweet. While he had been exonerated, he couldn't ignore the reality that many others had suffered under Liam's unchecked authority. In a statement outside the courthouse, Dwayne addressed the crowd of reporters and supporters. "This isn't just about me," he said firmly. "It's about accountability, about justice for everyone who has been silenced or mistreated. Today is a step in the right direction, but the fight doesn't end here." The trial not only cleared Dwayne's name, but sparked a larger conversation about systemic issues in law enforcement. Liam Marshall's downfall became a symbol of what could happen when power is abused, and his case served as a turning point for those demanding change. After the courtroom doors closed behind him, Dwayne turned to Lisa as they descended the courthouse steps. The media frenzy still swirling outside. Cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions, but Dwayne paid them no mind. He lowered his voice, speaking only to Lisa. "Keep an eye on the next trial, Lisa," he said, his tone calm but firm. "This isn't over yet. I want to know that justice is fully served, not just for me, but for everyone Liam has harmed." Lisa nodded, her expression resolute. "You have my word. We're going to see this through." Over the next several weeks, the investigation into Liam Marshall unraveled a shocking pattern of behavior. Complaints that had been buried or dismissed were brought back to light. Witnesses who had been too afraid to speak up before now came forward. Emboldened by the public outrage surrounding the case, the evidence painted a damning portrait of a man who had wielded his badge like a weapon, using his authority to target and oppress those he deemed beneath him. The district attorney's office moved swiftly, compiling a comprehensive case against Liam. The charges were extensive: abuse of power, racial discrimination, falsifying reports, and assault. The court scheduled a trial, and the media coverage intensified as the public awaited what many called a reckoning. The day of Liam's trial was a far cry from the confidence he had displayed during Dwayne's case. When Liam arrived at the courthouse, the once proud officer seemed diminished, his shoulders hunched, and his face pale. The cameras that had once bolstered his ego now felt like searchlights, exposing every crack in his facade. Protesters gathered outside, holding signs demanding accountability and justice for his victims. The chant of "No one is above the law" echoed through the streets. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution laid out a meticulous case against Liam. They presented damning evidence, video footage of his altercations, recorded testimony from victims, and documents that revealed a disturbing pattern of targeting minorities during traffic stops and falsifying charges to justify his actions. Each piece of evidence chipped away at any defense Liam might have hoped to mount. One of the most harrowing moments came when a former victim took the stand. A young man recounted how Liam had pulled him over for a fabricated reason, berated him with racial slurs, and arrested him on false charges. His voice shook as he described the humiliation and fear he had felt, and the courtroom was silent as his testimony underscored the human toll of Liam's actions. The defense struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence. Liam's attorney tried to argue that his actions were misinterpreted, that he had acted out of caution rather than malice. But the jury's expressions remained stoic, their minds seemingly already made up. After days of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with their decision. The courtroom was packed, tension thick in the air as the foreperson rose to deliver the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Liam Marshall, guilty on all counts," she announced, her voice steady. The words hit Liam like a hammer. His face drained of color, and he slumped slightly in his chair. The judge wasted no time proceeding to sentencing, her tone stern and unforgiving. "Mr. Marshall," she began, her eyes cold as they bore into him, "you were entrusted with the power to serve and protect. Instead, you used that power to harm, to discriminate, and to violate the very laws you were sworn to uphold. Your actions have caused irreparable damage, not only to your victims but to the integrity of the justice system itself." The judge paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "For your crimes, you were sentenced to 3 years of probation and mandatory community service. However, due to the gravity of your abuse of power, you will also serve 6 months in jail, effective immediately." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and Liam's head dropped into his hands. The judge continued, her voice unrelenting. "This sentence is not just a punishment for your actions. It is a message to every officer who believes they are above the law. Abuse of power will not be tolerated." Liam's fall from grace was swift and brutal. After the trial, he was taken into custody, the cameras capturing his walk out of the courthouse in handcuffs. His face was a mask of defeat, his once proud demeanor replaced by shame. The photos quickly circulated in the media, and public opinion, already against him, turned even harsher. In the days that followed, Liam's life unraveled further. The police department issued a statement condemning his actions and formally terminated his employment. His colleagues, many of whom had once looked up to him, now distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with a man whose name had become synonymous with disgrace. At home, Liam's family life disintegrated. His wife filed for divorce, taking their children with her. Neighbors who had once greeted him warmly now avoided him, their glances filled with disdain. Liam found himself utterly isolated, the weight of his choices crushing him. Inside the jail, Liam faced a harsh reality. Other inmates, many of whom he had likely encountered during his time as an officer, were quick to remind him of his fall. The guards offered no special treatment, and Liam was left to grapple with the consequences of his actions in the most unforgiving of environments. The trial and sentencing of Liam Marshall became a watershed moment in the fight against abuse of power in law enforcement. Advocacy groups used the case as a rallying cry for systemic reform, calling for greater oversight and accountability within police departments. Policies were reviewed, training programs were overhauled, and the voices of marginalized communities were amplified like never before. For Dwayne, the outcome was bittersweet. While justice had been served, he remained deeply aware of the countless others who had suffered similar injustices but never received their day in court. In interviews, he spoke candidly about the need for continued vigilance and reform. "This isn't about one man," Dwayne said during a televised address. "It's about the system that allowed someone like him to operate unchecked for so long. It's about making sure that no one else has to endure what I or his other victims went through. This is a fight that doesn't end with one trial." For Liam, the consequences of his actions were inescapable. His reputation was irreparably tarnished, his career destroyed, and his personal life in shambles. Once a man who had thrived on power and control, he was now left to reflect on the destruction he had wrought, both on others and himself. As the years passed, Liam's name faded from headlines, remembered only as a cautionary tale of unchecked authority and the high price of prejudice. Justice had been served, but the echoes of the case continued to shape the pursuit of a fairer, more accountable system for all. The trial of Officer Liam Marshall became more than just a courtroom drama. It evolved into a symbol of accountability for systemic misconduct within law enforcement. The overwhelming evidence presented during the case, from damning testimonies to video recordings of abuse, shattered any illusion of his innocence. His fall from grace exposed not just his own actions but a wider, deeply rooted issue within the system that had protected him for so long. As Liam's trial unfolded, it became clear that his behavior was not an isolated incident. Investigations into his past revealed a troubling pattern of abuse, false arrests, racial profiling, and excessive use of force. Dozens of complaints had been filed against him over the years, but most were quietly dismissed or swept under the rug by his superiors. The revelation that these complaints had been ignored or mishandled brought into question the integrity of the entire department. The court's decision to convict Liam on multiple charges, abuse of power, assault, and falsification of reports, was seen as a landmark moment. He was sentenced to 3 years of probation, mandatory community service, and 6 months in jail, a sentence that many considered lenient given the gravity of his actions. However, the significance of the case lay not just in his punishment, but in the broader implications it carried. The public outcry that followed the case forced the police department to take a hard look at itself. Under pressure from advocacy groups, community leaders, and the media, the department's leadership launched a full-scale internal review. A task force was formed to investigate patterns of misconduct, identify officers with repeated complaints against them, and overhaul existing policies to ensure greater transparency and accountability. One of the key findings of the task force was a culture of complacency within the department, where officers like Liam had been allowed to operate unchecked. Superiors often ignored or downplayed complaints, dismissing them as misunderstandings or exaggerations. This lack of oversight not only enabled abusive officers, but also eroded trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. In response, the department implemented a series of reforms aimed at rebuilding that trust. A new disciplinary board was established to handle complaints, staffed by independent reviewers and community representatives to ensure impartiality. Body cameras were made mandatory for all officers, with strict protocols for recording and storing footage. Training programs were revamped to include de-escalation tactics, implicit bias education, and lessons on cultural sensitivity. The case also spurred legislative action at the state level. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at increasing oversight of law enforcement agencies, creating independent bodies to investigate allegations of misconduct, and strengthening protections for whistleblowers within the police force. These measures were widely supported by the public, who had grown weary of hearing about officers abusing their power without facing consequences. For the community, the case was a turning point. It provided a rare instance where an abusive officer was held accountable, sending a clear message that no one, not even those in uniform, is above the law. Advocacy groups used the momentum to push for further reforms, organizing town halls and rallies to keep the conversation alive. Survivors of police misconduct, many of whom had been silenced or ignored for years, found the courage to come forward and share their stories. Yet, his downfall was a reminder that systemic change is not about targeting individuals alone. It's about addressing the structures that allow such individuals to thrive. Liam's case was a symptom of a larger disease, one that required not just punishment but prevention. Years later, the case of Liam Marshall was still referenced as a pivotal moment in the fight for police reform. It became a teaching point in police academies, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of accountability. For many, it was a painful but necessary reckoning, a step toward a more just and equitable system. Dwayne Johnson, the man at the center of the case, continued to use his platform to advocate for change. In interviews and speeches, he emphasized the importance of accountability and community-led oversight. "This wasn't just about me," he often said. "It was about every person who has ever been silenced or mistreated, and it's about making sure this never happens again." The legacy of the case was clear. A flawed system had been forced to confront its failings. While there was still work to be done, the trial of Liam Marshall had proven that justice, though slow, could prevail, and that no one, no matter their position, is untouchable. Love this content? Like the video and subscribe for more amazing updates. Share your thoughts below. Your support means to us.